At the beginning of Lent, we talked about liminality and being in liminal times. And for those of you who weren't here, I'll give you a really quick definition of liminality. Liminality is that threshold that is between one moment and another. And so you can think of liminality as that time of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Liminality is Holy Week, the time between when Jesus entered Jerusalem and when Jesus was killed on the cross. Liminality is also the time between the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's the time between things that we feel comfortable and know, and the next thing that we feel comfortable and know. And in liminality, we are very uncomfortable because we want to make something happen. And at the beginning of Lent, I said we have to acknowledge, First Plymouth, that you all have been in liminality for 6+ years. From George's departure, you were in liminality until Jenny arrived, and then you were in liminality as COVID started, and then again as COVID came to an end, and then again as Jenny left, and then again as Bob arrived, and then again as Bob left and I arrived. That's a long period of liminal time. And our anxieties are up because we want to be done with it and on to the next. And what I talked about at the beginning of Lent is that there are 3 movements that if we can make these inner shifts, these inner movements, then that anxiety and that fear of being in this liminal time lightens and lessens, and we find ourselves grounded again. And we find ourselves in the presence of the sacred, and we find ourselves centered. And when we're grounded and we're centered and we're present with God and we have released all of the things and perceptions that we have that we think we want to do, then God takes us through and out of liminality. And the 3 shifts are to shift from knowing to unknowing, which I will come back to because that's today's sermon. The second shift is to shift from advocating, and we who are social justice people, we have this really great view of advocating, meaning we're out protesting in social justice. This advocating is, I know the answer, and my answer is right. We have to shift from that to attending, where we look to each other as community and we say, how can I hear you better? How can I care more fully for you? How can we peel the layers of connection so that we can become one unified community of faith? And the final shift is the shift from striving, which we all want to get through liminality, to surrender. And that's one of the hardest shifts to make because we feel like we need to do something. But every time, if you look at Exodus, every time the Israelites tried to do something to strive through that wilderness, they wandered even longer. And when they figured out how to surrender to the pillar of light and the pillar of smoke and to Moses and to really just let God guide them, they were able to come to the entrance of the land of milk and honey of Canaan. And so we will be steeping ourselves in these ancient stories to talk about these different movements. And today's story is Lazarus, that shift from knowing to unknowing. That shift to be able to really lean into God's mystery and accept things that we think cannot happen because we know that can't actually happen. And so we can have a lot of compassion for Martha and Mary who have buried Lazarus because he got sick and he died. And what do? You wrap him up and you put him in the tomb and you seal the tomb, and that's that, and you grieve his loss. But Jesus showed up and he said, there is a different way. Unknow everything that you know and believe in the mystery of God and God's miracles. And then he called forth Lazarus from that tomb to new life. And Lazarus also had to unknow. Lazarus' spirit and soul had to unknow the fact that he had died and could come back as a new person. And he had to unknow what he had been taught. And it is very hard to unknow. It really is. And I will start with a little bit of a confession. I know how to lead people through processes of vision and mission. I know how to lead congregations through interim processes. I know it all. I've done it so many times that this is how we do it. Except God continues to remind me that, yes, this movement, this wandering, this liminality, these three shifts are important, but just because I know the way that has always worked, that has worked for previous congregations, doesn't mean that way works here, right? So I have to unknow my assumptions about what works and listen to Spirit saying, try this instead of what you always did. Try this action, try this thinking, try this way of inviting people into these different shifts, and trust that. And it is hard. When we have all this knowledge and all of this experience, and it has worked again and again and again and again and again, we expect it to work, right? We have that in our professional lives. Any of you who have worked your career, you have had moments where you're like, why is this not going the way I think it should go? This always worked. What just happened? And this is the work of unknowing. There's a humility that has to happen as we unknow. God's not saying, ignore everything that you have learned, ignore everything that has worked for you, but what God is saying is, be humble enough to acknowledge and recognize that, wow, that worked in different places, that worked with different congregations, that was really helpful at different times and in different situations, but this one takes a little bit of a different way. Acknowledge. And there's this humility in acknowledging that that means we go, what is it? If everything that I've done or everything that I've tried to do and the way in which I know to do it, it feels really anxiety producing, right? When God is asking you to sort of abandon all of the things that have worked in the past and to try something completely new and to trust that God's guidance is going to take us to where we need to go. I'm going to say that again because I want you to think about that. It is anxiety producing to let go of all of the things that have worked in the past and all of the ways in which we've done things in the past that have gotten us to where we are. We're grateful for that, but it's anxiety producing when God goes, that's not going to work anymore. You have to try something new that you've never done before. And trust that God will show us the way. I could give you a moment to let you recognize how anxiety producing that is. That somehow we have to let go of that. And that's why I have said many times, and I need to remind that to myself, that just because that's the way it has always been done doesn't mean it works now. We all have to remind ourselves of that's the movement of unknowing. My friend in Melbourne gave me a really great image. And she called me up this week on FaceTime, because it's international. And she says to me, I just came out of meditation, and you need to hear this. Jesus told me, don't touch the river. And I was like, oh, that's it. Don't touch the river. We want to solve the problem. And I want you to imagine yourselves as just floating in the river. The river is the holy, the river is the sacred, the river is God, the river is the universe. However you experience this creator, that is the river, and we are floating in it. And now imagine a stick, right? When you were a little kid and you were on top of a bridge and you threw a stick in the river, the stick did not do anything. It literally floated down the river. And when it came to a rock, it trusted that the current of the river would take it around that rock. And if it got stuck on that rock, it just waited for another stick or wave or leaf or whatever was floating down the river to dislodge it around the rock, and off it went. There was no worry about any of the obstacles that were present as it was floating down the river. Don't touch the river. Don't try to control it. Don't try to keep ourselves from running into a rock or an obstacle or getting stuck somewhere or falling over a waterfall. Don't do any of that. Just trust the river. Trust it. Trust the movement of God, that it is going to take us where we need to go. This is the unknowing. If we can unknow all of those mechanisms that we learned to make sure that if we're floating down a river, we don't run into rocks, because we like to, if you've ever been tubing, you want to push yourself off of that rock or make sure that you're maneuvering yourselves through the rapids in the easier places and not the harder places. But God is inviting us to not do that, to not touch the river, to not touch any of the obstacles, but to fully be that stick, that leaf that floats down the river, trusting the current, trusting that it will get wherever it needs to go, and not worrying about how it got there. Let us not touch the river. That's the hardest part. The invitation is to not touch the river, to just be, to just trust. And when we have that urge to touch the river, to remind ourselves, don't touch the river, unknow whatever it is that is trying to tell us that we need to touch that river and to keep ourselves from that obstacle, unknow it, trust, and rest into that water and let it flow around the obstacle. Let us unknow that which is keeping us from freely floating down the river. Amen.